Hi, and welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Thursday, April 17th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with diplomatic correspondent Lazer Berman. Hi, Lazer.
Hi, Jessica. Good morning. Moedim l'simcha.
It's good to have you here. It is day 559 of the war. On Tuesday afternoon, an Islamic Jihad video of hostage Ram Braslavsky, still held in Gaza, appeared. And in the video, Ram Braslavsky begged Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to, quote, "get me out of here," end quote. Also happening on Tuesday, the Prime Minister met with families of 5 hostages believed to still be alive. There were several of those family members who were meeting with the Prime Minister for the first time since their children were taken hostage a year and a half ago. Meanwhile, Hamas has been said to reject the latest Israeli proposal for a ceasefire. We'll discuss what has been happening in the hostage talks, as well as what's next in the U.S.-Iranian talks that are slated to continue on Saturday. Stay with us. Okay, so Lazer, first let's review just for a moment what happened with the Israeli government's security cabinet meeting last night. There was a phone meeting with the prime minister on the call and other security cabinet ministers, including Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar, who is expected to be leaving his post within the next couple of weeks. What happened there, and how does that reflect on what we're thinking about and following right now?
Yeah, so Prime Minister Netanyahu held another meeting. It's called a situational assessment on the hostage topic. This was a phone meeting. It included members of the hostage negotiating team. There were senior defense officials there, according to Netanyahu's office. And interestingly, Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar was also part of this phone meeting. Of course, this is interesting because Netanyahu and his cabinet have been trying for weeks, even longer, to fire him. They voted last month to fire Bar. There's a temporary injunction by the High Court keeping him in office, but Netanyahu continues to say he's going to fire him. He has interviewed potential replacements, so he is still part of these discussions, and I think that is actually the right move. Now, we don't know much about what was said. We only know what the Prime Minister's office has released, and I'll quote you here. Netanyahu instructed the continuation of measures to advance the release of the hostages. So basically continuing to do what they're doing. And I'll remind you that there is an offer on the table. This would be an extension or a return to the ceasefire with the demand that Hamas release a significant number, 9, 10, we've heard 11 in the past, living Israeli hostages. And then they would be willing to talk about the end of the war. Of course, if Hamas meets Israel's war aims, if they disarm, if leaders go into exile, if they have no future in ruling the Gaza Strip.
Okay, let's also keep on looking at the continuing hostage talks, even though we keep on hearing that they're stalled and that they're back on again. Right now, what we're seeing in our headlines is that Hamas turned down the Israeli offer for a ceasefire, which included a demand that the terrorist group, disarm, and Hamas refused to do so. The Hamas terrorist group also said on the same day that it had lost contact with hostage Idan Alexander's handlers, with the terrorists that are keeping him captive. Is that Hamas playing hardball? Does it mean something else? How do we look at that within the realm of the diplomatic talks that are going on, within the realm of the hostage talks?
Yeah, we continue to hear, we heard this yesterday, we hear it today as well, Hamas officials saying that they will not accept any partial deals, that they are not willing to accept Israel's conditions. And this Idan Alexander statement that they've lost contact with the people who are guarding him, as they say it, basically his kidnappers. They're trying to, I think, play to the Israeli part of Israeli society that is protesting against the continuation of the war. And they see that these letters are being released and they're saying, okay, Israel's military operations are putting these hostages in danger. It's also a signal to the Trump administration that Israel's military operations in Gaza are putting the hostages in danger. They're trying to work through the Israeli public, through Washington, to get pressure on Israel to stop the military operation, which continues to grow. But big picture here, I think Hamas is not moving on its key demand. Its key demand is that if they're going to release a large number of living hostages beyond just Idan Alexander, which would be kind of a gift to the Trump administration, if they're going to do what Israel wants and release 9, 10, 11 hostages, they're only going to do that if they feel that it will lead to the end of the war. Of course, Israel has been consistent throughout that that's not something that they're willing to do. So the contacts continue. The Trump administration is trying to make this happen. Israel's trying to find some formula. But I think we're pretty much in the same place, that Hamas knows that the more time that goes by, the more hostages it releases, the ones that it continues to hold are more valuable, as terrible as it sounds. And therefore, they're going to be very careful about releasing them.
We're also seeing reports that negotiations for the hostages have lost momentum since chief negotiator Ron Dermer, one of the prime minister's closest advisors since Ron Dermer took over. Other reports say that Dermer is only aiming for one kind of final push of hostages. And of course, there have been many protests on Israel's streets, especially in Jerusalem, where Dermer lives. Many protests pointing at him, calling to him, asking him to move farther and faster and do more. What are you thinking about all of that?
Yeah, so we've heard this from a number of sources. I've heard this as well, that the Qataris especially are unhappy with Dermer since he took over from Mossad chief David Barnea and from Ronen Bar, the Shin Bet chief. They feel that it is going slower now, that he doesn't have the same urgency of reaching a deal. And we've also heard reports coming out of meetings that Dermer has held, talks he's given off record, even comments he's made in front of some of the families, that he does not believe that it will be possible to get all of the hostages out. So therefore, he is trying to maximize the number of living hostages in the final release that he thinks he can get. And then from there, it'll probably be a return to war. Of course, if you are a family of one of the hostages that is still in Gaza, that is not something that you want to hear. And also for a country like Qatar, who is banking its reputation as someone who can mediate a successful end to this, this is also something that they don't want to hear.
Also, Laser, we also have reports of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meeting with families of 5 hostages and also speaking to some hostage families on the phone. It feels like a shift from what's been for the last few months, when families ask to speak to the prime minister, but don't hear back from him, but don't hear from him, but don't have any meetings in person. Again, does that represent anything in terms of diplomacy? Does that mean anything in terms of where we are right now?
In terms of what Netanyahu meeting with families, yeah, he met with the families of 5 of those male hostages who are still in Gaza today. I don't think it really means anything in terms of Israel's diplomacy. I think it means a lot in terms of it's not going to affect what Israel does at the negotiating table. I really don't think it does. I think the important thing here is that Netanyahu understands that in terms of domestic politics, not diplomacy, he has to show that he is in touch with families, that he's talking to them, that he's meeting with them. He came under criticism about a month ago for not speaking to some of the very prominent families. And then he very quickly met with them, spoke to them on the phone, and has since then been releasing these statements from the prime minister's office, making clear to the public that he is, every time that he's speaking with families, that he's laying out what the situation is, and that he continues to do so to show that he cares about them and to blunt criticism that he is apathetic to or is not giving access to the hostage families.
Okay. Let's take a quick break. When we're back, we'll talk about Iran and your analysis about that situation and about those talks that are taking place. Stay with us. So just to review a little bit of what has been in the last days, Steve Witkoff, President Donald Trump's envoy to the Mideast, first said a few days ago that Washington would be satisfied with a cap on uranium enrichment in terms of the talks between the U.S. and Iran. But then he had a very quick turnaround saying that the uranium processing program would have to be completely dismantled. Iran, in turn, said that its uranium enrichment program was non-negotiable in terms of any of its talks. Now they're due to meet again in Oman on Saturday. That's a week following their first quote unquote constructive meeting. You described that meeting in your analysis as having surprisingly positive vibes. So each side, US and Iran, seems to have its game plan, but what really is good for Israel here? Is anything good for Israel?
On Iran, listen, there's some worrying news for Israel. I think there was reason for Israel to be optimistic in January as Trump was getting his national security team together. You had people like Marco Rubio, who's the Secretary of State. You had Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, both senior figures in the Trump administration, both Iran hawks. I think Israel has to be very happy with that. But in recent weeks, you had the meeting in the Oval Office. I was there, where Trump surprised the Israelis by saying there was quote unquote direct talks and that they were going to happen on Saturday in Oman. It seemed to take Netanyahu by surprise. And then the fact that there will be a second round of talks, it seems like it's going to happen in Rome, would indicate that Witkoff did not put forth any demand that Israel would have wanted, which would be the dismantling of Iran's nuclear program. If he had done that, you wouldn't have had that extended conversation after the meeting between Witkoff and Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi. You wouldn't have had a week later going back to talks. So I think that is very indicative of what the U.S. at least is saying at these talks. Now, let's not forget Witkoff, no experience in diplomacy before this current position. He is someone who certainly doesn't know the technical details of Iran's nuclear program or the sanctions. So it's not someone I'm comfortable meeting face to face with the Iranians, even though these are quote unquote indirect. So it could be also, we're not exactly sure what he's saying. On the plus side, he's an effective negotiator because he is seen to have Trump's ear and he is speaking for Trump. So I think he's a credible negotiator for the Iranians in that regard, but that's not necessarily good for Israel. Now, Iran, I think, will go for an interim deal. There's really no way of getting a comprehensive deal that's better than the 2015 JCPOA in 2 months, which is Trump's deadline. That's not going to happen. I think what Iran wants to happen, and this is good for Trump also, is to get an interim deal, something that kind of puts some caps on enrichment, maybe destroys destroys some of the centrifuges, reintroduces IAEA inspections. And then Trump can say he got the win. And Iran can now play for time, drag out talks for months, years, and know that as long as talks are going on, Israel can't strike. Now, I'll remind you that today, the New York Times had that piece saying that when Netanyahu came to Washington last week, Trump would not approve an Israeli strike. And of course, Israel really doesn't feel like it can do an extended strike or a proper strike that will take out much of Iran's nuclear program if it doesn't have American support, American backing, even American involvement. So what we're seeing now is that as long as talks are extended, as long as they're going on, as long as Iran can look to drag them out, there's really little chance that Trump is going to sign off on a strike by Israel on Iran's nuclear program. None of this can be good for Israel. And I think Netanyahu has to be very careful here. He can't be seen as undermining one of Trump's signature goals in his foreign policy, which is to show that he could get a better deal with Iran than the JCPOA, than Obama did. Biden tried for years, couldn't get anything done. So Trump wants to see this happen, and Netanyahu cannot be the one to get in the way of it. So all in all, with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, situation's good. With Syria, Israel's doing what it wants. Though we do see the worrying, there's some clouds on the horizon that the U.S. might be pulling all of its troops out starting in the coming months. Of course, the potential for confrontation with Turkey is always there, and that is growing. Gaza, it's hard to say where things stand there in terms of whether we should be optimistic. The ground operation with the airstrikes is ongoing, but it has failed so far because the logic of that operation is not to defeat Hamas right now, but to push them into accepting the deal that Israel wants. This is not the big maneuver yet. Israeli troops are going where they want. Hamas is barely putting up a fight, but it is not having the strategic effect that they want. And of course, there's worrying signs about, there's that report on IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir saying that we just don't have the reservists to do the big maneuver now. The IDF denied that report, but there are worrying signs about the percentage of reservists who are reporting for duty on their fourth, fifth round of duty. So there's worrying signs there. I think the biggest reason to worry is over the Iran nuclear talks and where they're going to go for Israel. But, we're going to keep an eye on these things. You'll see every week these stories kind of change, move in new directions. I think some of that is a reflection of the Trump administration and his style. But there are some big questions there. Where do the Iran talks go? Where does the Gaza operation go? What will Hamas say about these hostage talks? Will it show any flexibility? Will Israel's pressure pay off? All that remains to be seen.
Thanks so much, Laser, for being with us today on today's Daily Briefing.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have about this or other episodes, always feel free to drop us an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. And of course, you can always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care. Moadim l'simcha, and see you soon.